Good morning and welcome to University Unitarian Church. My name is Beth Chronister and I serve here as the Minister of Social Justice and Pastoral Care. And it is good to be together on this morning. I join you this morning with our soloist Callie Lindenmeyer and pianist Dwight Beckmeyer, as well as Byron and David on the tech team week in and week out. And on this morning, I am aware that we are coming up on 6 months of being online and of sheltering in place and living within a strange new normal. And so on this morning, I am easing into the memories of you, remembering where you sit in this sanctuary, remembering the image of families together, of old friends leaning on one another. Your presence is still here somehow. We miss you. We hope you are well. We're glad that you are here as part of this community in whatever fashion that you can be right now. Before we begin our service this morning, I have 2 quick announcements. One is that on this coming Wednesday, our evening Vespers is going to be on singing resilience. We'll be joined by Jacob Finkel, the director of the IGC, and members of UUC to come and lead in song about what is some of the music that helps them be strong and that helps them come alive. And our second announcement comes from the economic justice team here at UUC, and it's about they've been working to raise awareness and increase participation in the U.S. Census year. In the midst of everything right now, we are also in a census year, which happens every decade. And the current census response rate is about 63%. And this is in contrast to the 2010 census, which had a response rate of around 74%. And this is particularly concerning given the announcement this past week of shortening the response period to the end of September, despite the number of difficulties of doing this during a time of COVID. And just as a reminder, the census is essential in determining the distribution of resources, the drawing of voting districts, and the determining the number of seats in the House of Representatives for each state, which means that this census will affect the elections for the coming decade. Historically, the U.S. Census has undercounted young children, undocumented immigrants, renters, American Indians, Latino and Black communities. And this undercounting is just another way that these groups are excluded from political power. In the fight for a truly representational democracy, the census is key. And so the economic justice team encourages you, if you have not done so yet, to please fill out your census, to get the word out there. It is so essential for how we shall move forward together in this next decade. Welcome to worship this morning. Welcome to University Unitarian Church. It is good to be together. I call us to worship with these words. May we be reminded here of our highest aspirations and inspired to bring our gifts of love and service to the altar of humanity. May we know that we are not isolated beings, but connected in mystery and miracle to the universe, to this community, to one another, and to the earth. Would you please join me now in singing our doxology?
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung through every land by every tongue.
Our meditation this morning comes in the form of a prayer from the Reverend Teresa Inez Soto, entitled "To the People Who Have Mistaken Freedom for Liberation." Would you please join me now in the spirit of prayer and meditation, breathing in to this moment and releasing wherever you are. To be free, you must embrace the breadth of your own existence without apology, even if they try to take it from you. You must know, not that you can do whatever you want. You are not a kudzu vine eating entire hillsides for the purpose of feeding your own lush life. You must know instead that inside you are entire universes, milky blue, magenta, and gold, expanding. But to actually be free, you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside of everyone else. Being free is not a license, but a promise. Would you please join me now in a moment of shared silence? And I invite you to add the prayers, the meditations, the longings of your own hearts. Blessed be, and amen. At this point in our service, we gratefully receive the morning offering to go in support of the ongoing life, work, and ministry of this congregation and community. Following the offertory, Callie will lead us in singing Dona Nobis Pacem. You're invited to listen to it once and join on the second round. Would you please join me now in saying the words we say each week? This church is a community of ourselves. Its energy and resources are our energy and resources. Its wealth is what we share. When we contribute to the life of this community, we affirm our lives within it.
Perché può lasciarmi sola in pianto, oh Dei, può lasciarmi, oh Dei, perché?
Beautiful, thank you. I was just imagining that, when that harpsichord was constructed, who would have ever imagined it would be live streamed someday? What a wild time we are in. My goodness, these technologies coming together as time rolls on. So I have been totally perplexed by the ritual of communion at different points in my life. Born and raised a Unitarian Universalist, I did not grow up taking communion, except on the occasional visit to my grandparents' Presbyterian Church in Abilene, Kansas. On those Sundays, I remember sitting next to my grandparents in the pew, filling in coloring pages of biblical stories, and being invited to walk up with everyone else to the front to receive a drink of juice and a cracker. Having never been explained what I was participating in, I came to the conclusion that the wafer and the juice was something of a mid-service snack. A snack that I thought would be much improved on with possibly some animal crackers or granola bars, but nobody ever asked me, and I possibly knew better than to share my opinion. In theology school, I encountered the ritual of communion again in the study of Christian history. And once more, I was baffled by the significance of the ritual and lost within the theological debates across history about what Jesus meant at the Last Supper when he offered the bread and wine to his followers and asked them to do this in memory of me. So imagine my surprise when, at the end of a 5-day walking pilgrimage from Selma to Montgomery, following in the footsteps of the 1965 Voting Rights March, that very scripture kept running through my mind. Do this in memory of me. On that final day of the pilgrimage, the small, multiracial, multi-religious coalition with whom I walked completed the 54-mile march at the steps of Alabama's state capitol in Montgomery, where we read the words spoken by Dr. King to the crowd on March 21st, 1965. On that same day, we traveled to the Civil Rights Memorial, a memorial which remembers the martyrs of the Southern Black freedom struggle, including the 4 Black girls killed in the bombing of a Birmingham church, and a white UU woman, Viola Luiso, who was killed by the KKK as she drove marchers back to Selma from that voting rights march. We visited the Legacy Museum, which traces the history of anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the U.S. from the domestic slave trade to Jim Crow to the modern-day system of mass incarceration. And finally, we paid homage at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice created by the Equal Justice Initiative, as was the Legacy Museum. This memorial, opened in 2018, is the first national memorial, 2 years ago, first national memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. This memorial is chilling. Over 4,400 names of Black men, women, and children killed by lynching are preserved there, carved into iron blocks with the dates and locations where they drew their final breath, often in front of crowds of white spectators. Their lives and their deaths remembered in a country that would largely rather forget or ignore this violent history and its modern implications. After that day, The group was quiet, introspective as we drove back to Atlanta that night, pondering what this all meant for our lives going forward. I was filled with memories of the last week and memories of the best and worst of this country. The long history of white supremacy, racial hatred, and voter suppression, and the courageous movement and leaders that rose up, led by spirit, emboldened by song and scripture, and the call for justice to fight for their rights and for the rights of future generations to be full participants in this nation. Do this in memory of me. Again in my mind, as I ran through the faces and names of people whose memories I had encountered on that day. And I wondered, maybe Jesus was less concerned about the bread and the wine and more concerned that his followers not forget his lived teachings and compassion, radical hospitality, nonviolence, and speaking truth to power. Maybe Jesus was imploring those that survived to carry forward his memory so that his life, his ministry, and his state-sanctioned killing not be in vain. Communion, as a word, is understood as an intimate connection, a connection between I and thou. It implies a deep sharing, particularly a spiritual one. As a Christian ritual of partaking consecrated bread and wine, communion brings believers into intimate contact with one another, with their religious history, and with their understanding of God. What does it mean to have an intimate connection with history? To be in communion with someone who has now left this earth, to live as if the past were not past, and the people who have lived and died before us not beyond connection. In a country that trends toward amnesia and has a preference for the anxious now, it is a radical choice to remember, not only in our words but in our deeds. Whose memory do you carry forward? And whose memory carries you forward? Are they your ancestors, perhaps? Teachers you've had in life, or people you've never had the chance to meet? These last months of uprisings and organizing in the movement for Black life are explicitly inspired by memory. It is the memories of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others that people carry and call out in the streets, in city councils, and state legislatures demanding change. Memories of friends and family who have been harassed and harmed by racist policing. Memories of a history that has never been reconciled, redeemed, or even repented. As people march and organize, they are engaging in the spiritual practices of grieving and lament, of bearing witness rather than looking away from the evils of institutional racism and militarism, and of using their breath to remember through action those whose breath was robbed of them. Do this in memory of me. Less than a month ago, this country lost a great man whose life was defined by activism and advocacy. One of the big six leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and beyond. On July 17th, Representative John Lewis passed away at the age of 80 of pancreatic cancer. Now, John was born the child of sharecroppers in Troy, Alabama in 1940. And he was born a child destined, his family remembers. He was born in a state that was known at the time for its use of violence and Jim Crow laws to suppress black voters and to maintain a severely segregated society. He wanted to be a preacher. He longed for more education. He longed for the day of desegregation and was shocked in 1954 with the passing of the Brown versus Board in the Supreme Court that his schools did not change. His life did not change. And so as a young person, he was inspired by the spiritual teachings of nonviolence, the words of Dr. King, which he heard on the radio in the Montgomery bus boycott. This is how change could happen. By the age of 20, he had already become active in sit-ins to desegregate lunch counters and was one of the original Freedom Riders, which organized to desegregate the busing system throughout the South. As the chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John was the youngest speaker to address the crowds at the March on Washington in 1963. He declared, "We all recognize the fact that if any radical social, political, and economic changes are to take place in our society, the people, the masses, must bring them about." But John Lewis is perhaps most famous for his role in leading the march that came to be known as Bloody Sunday, the day that this image is recorded from, with John as one of the leaders out in front in that trench coat next to his colleague, Hosea. And on this day, some 500 marchers, were leaving Selma with the intention to march all the way to Montgomery, and they were doing this in memory of their friend and colleague Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young black man who was killed by a white state trooper for wanting to vote. And as they crossed that Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met with batons, mounted sheriffs, white vigilantes, and tear gas. The footage of Bloody Sunday was broadcast across the nation that night, eventually coalescing in the Voting Rights March of 1965 and the passing of the Voting Rights Act shortly thereafter. For decades, Lewis continued his work to protect and expand the right to vote to disenfranchised voters, both as the director of the Voter Education Project and as a U.S. congressman, all the way through the final years in office when he saw the Voting Rights Act gutted by a decision by the Supreme Court and a resurgence of voter suppression tactics and extreme gerrymandering over the past decade. John knew how serious the power, the potential of voting was and is, how it could reshape the country. In his words, "The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society." During his 33 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, Lewis continued to champion the Voting Rights Act, along with supporting legislation for health care, same-sex marriage, gun control reform, once staying up all night on the floor of the House for gun control reform following the shooting in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub. He worked for the alleviation of poverty and improvements in education. Because of his actions, his leadership presence, and the ways that he was with people, he was considered the conscience of Congress. Following his passing, members of UUC gathered with the leaders of our racial justice and UU The Vote team to discuss a recent documentary recalling his life entitled John Lewis, Good Trouble. He is often heard saying to get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And as I watched his story in the archival footage from Freedom Summer and Bloody Sunday, I found myself weeping. Weeping for the man who had lived and died. Weeping for my country, which has so often fallen short of the dream of democracy. Weeping for the dismantling and derision of democracy that we have witnessed over these last 4 years. Weeping because the footage of protesters getting hit with tear gas and batons in the 1960s felt eerily familiar to the police brutality that is happening at protest in our own city and in cities across the nation. There is a saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. I don't have to remind any of you that in the midst of these strange times, there is an election coming up. And the fate of our democracy seems uncertain at best. What does it mean to vote? Not only to vote, but to ensure that other people's voices are also heard, counted, so that we may reach that fragile and fruitful promise of becoming a truly representational democracy. As you fill out your ballots in this state where we can gratefully vote through mail with no problems, who is with you? Whose memories live on in your freedom to vote? This month marks the 100-year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in the U.S. on August 18th, 1920. From the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and for over 70 years thereafter, women and some men, black and white activists, worked tirelessly for generations to secure women's right to vote, to be full participants in the formation of this democracy. State by state, they organized and slowly won. Much like the organizers and marchers in the civil rights movement, the suffragettes protested and put their bodies on the line. They were arrested, beaten, and underwent hunger strikes in the fight for self-determination, in the fight to influence the policies that shape their lives, and in the fight that their voices be heard. Now, the 19th Amendment was always partial, for it was largely white women who were granted this freedom. The full right to vote was not available until the passing of the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act ended Jim Crow in the southern states. It's important to remember that the possibility of true democracy only dawned in 1965 in this country. And even with these laws in place, voter rights continue to be suppressed through tactics such as voter ID laws, closing down polling stations in black and brown neighborhoods, and the recent attempts to undermine the U.S. Postal Service, specifically aimed at suppressing the votes of people of color, of poor folk, and progressives as a whole. Which is maybe why it becomes so important and even life-giving to remember these not-so-distant histories, to remember those who gave their lives to a cause so that others, maybe generations later, would inherit a more perfect union, to remember whose shoulders you stand on, not only as a voter, but if you are so called, and if there ever was an election, it is this one, to yoke your energies to this long legacy of defending the right to vote and widening the circle of democracy. Suffragette Carrie Chapman Catt, founder of the League of Women Voters and suffragette who lived to see the 19th Amendment ratified when so many didn't, wrote these words: Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Understand what it means and what it can do for your country. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. From the halls of history, do this in memory of me. Voting is not only a political act, it is a sacred ritual, a spiritual practice to remember those who have gone before, and an act of hope for those who will come after. Out beyond partisan politics, beyond the anxious now, there is a promise of a country that is yet to be, and a long history of dreamers and fighters who worked to guide us there. Now is the chance to join in this sacred work, not only of voting, but working to extend and protect this right to those most disenfranchised and disengaged, and to do this as an acknowledgement of our sacred interdependence to one another. President Obama delivered John Lewis's eulogy last week. I close with his words. John knew that every single one of us has a God-given power, and that the fate of this democracy depends on how we use it. That democracy isn't automatic. It has to be nurtured. It has to be tended to. We have to work at it. It's hard. And so he knew it depends on whether we summer a measure, just a measure of John's moral courage to question what's right and what's wrong and call things as they are. He said that just as long as he had breath in his body, he would do everything he could to preserve this democracy. That as long as we have breath in our bodies, we have to continue his cause. If we want our children to grow up in a democracy, not just with elections, but a true democracy, a representative democracy, a big-hearted, tolerant, vibrant, inclusive America of perpetual self-creation, then we are going to have to be more like John. Keep your eyes on the prize, my friends, and blessings on your way. Would you please join now in singing hymn number 1028, Fire of Commitment.
From the light of days remembered burns a beacon bright and clear, guiding hands and hearts and spirits into faith set free from fear.
This closing image is of a ritual that has been developed over the past years of mostly women and others going to visit the grave sites of suffragettes, of Susan B. Anthony, of Ida B. Wells, and more, to place their "I voted" sticker on the gravestones of the women who made it so, because of them. If you're interested in learning more about how you can get involved in voter engagement and registration, we have a group here at UUC that's part of a national group, UU The Vote. And this group, led by Steve Carlson and joined by many of you, is gathering together to write letters, make calls about helping to expand this right and this invitation to be part of our democratic future to voters across the whole nation. We are doing this here in Seattle in partnership with the group Common Purpose. And if you're interested in learning more about that, Steve and I will be in the virtual coffee hour, and we'll have a breakout room specifically for people who would like to talk about this coming election, how to get involved. And so looking at this image and thinking about all those in your history who made it possible for you to be here and to live your life and be part of something greater than yourself, I offer you these words from the Reverend Wayne B. Arneson. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard. The path is never clear and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is a deeper truth. You are not alone. Blessings on you.